Okay. Y'all's assignment from not Matthew, but from Mark is chapter 10, correct?
Correct.
Great. Would someone like to start off by reading verses 1 through 12?
I can do it.
Perfect. Thank you. Go ahead.
Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judah and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." And did you say through 9 or through 12?
Through 12.
Okay. When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery."
All right. Thank you for giving me chapter 10. I'm excited to tackle this one with y'all. The first the first question is just what's difficult about this? That's not like it's not going to be hard to find those things. Oh. Where do you find what are the difficult parts you find in this? And let's start with that.
So in the beginning of all of our classes, we talked about those spiritual wounds, and for me, this is a big one because I'm a child of divorce, and my mother was basically told by the Catholic Church, you're a sinner, and my mom and dad got divorced for a very specific reason, and so that was a hard thing to swallow. It's like rejection right off the bat.
And it's not just from, I'm a child of divorce as well, it's not just from the church, it's from Jesus.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the paragraph that starts with verse 5 is particularly, as like an LGBT person, like very like, God made them male and female, and they were one flesh, and et cetera, and it's very like, so how do I fit into this equation that's being outlined here? It's like, seems like it's not written in a way that, I mean, whatever, it's 2,000 years ago, but like,
Mm-hmm.
It's not very inclusive.
yes.
No.
Well, and it's been used. Go ahead. Yeah, it's been.
Not to mention that it suddenly it's like, well, okay, hold on. So, again, like, I think there's so many things that when he says stuff, there's nuance, and then certainly some things probably get lost in translation here or there, but it's like, and then you've got cultural stuff as well, but it's like, okay, so are you sitting there saying that I did a wrong because my husband beat the crap out of me and I need to get out? Because logistically speaking, or logically speaking, that's clearly something God would be like, that was bad, yes, you should get out. So how did, this is a very, seemingly cut and dry thing, but there's got to be incredible nuance here because the world is nuanced and not black and white.
Mm-hmm. You're exactly right. I think when we're considering Jesus' response, one of the great places to start is understanding that first part. Some Pharisees came, and in order to test him, they asked. So right off the bat, Jesus is pretty good at sniffing out when someone is trying to test him, to try to trap him in some way. And so this is another occasion of someone trying to test Jesus. In this case, it's the Pharisees. And we've talked a little bit about the Pharisees, I think. These are the sect that really studies Torah, and specifically the commandments. trying to do everything they can to keep all of these commandments, not actually from a place of being of condemnation, but a place of Israel's not doing so great right now. We're under Roman occupation, and if we look back at Torah, when we're under occupation or in exile or something, it's usually because we've done something wrong. And so the Pharisees are trying to get people back to living according to Torah as a way of, if we live right with one another and right with God, then our situation might improve. But Jesus is out here preaching a very different gospel, a very different sort of good news, and challenging the Pharisees left and right, especially when it comes to kind of obscure laws in the Torah, and when Jesus calls them out for saying you're missing the point. So this is another one of those occasions where they're asking him a gotcha question, and yeah, Jesus doesn't get to give a lot of nuance. Instead, he kind of puts it back on them by instead of really answering their question right away, he said, "Well, what does it say? What does the book say?" And they read it back to him.
I think one of the reasons why I find this passage difficult is I don't really find Jesus' answer comforting or helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Because when he says that it's because of the hardness of your heart that God gave you that commandment, when you look back through like the purpose of the law and the way the law was given, it's supposed to be like this just special thing, and it's almost like there's an acknowledgement that the law wasn't just completely, and so it's not really comforting.
Mm-hmm.
His response. I can't say that I love it.
Any thoughts on that? I think it has a. I think that the hardness of heart part is pretty key to understanding Jesus' response, and he's acknowledging that that God made this provision because of humans' hardness of heart, because of our sinfulness, that we do consistently fail to live into healthy relationships and things like that, and that God allowed for for divorce to happen because not that it's part of God's plan, but that we consistently fail in our aim to be in right relationship with one another, and that it's the hardness of heart that is the reason why God allowed for such a thing. That it's not God's choice, but it's really a reflection of us not living up to our best.
So, one thing to keep in mind is that divorce is as old as humanity and marriage, right? And in the law, when Moses sort of gives this law, receives this law from God, essentially what the law does is to say if a man, and it was a man's right in the ancient world to leave a woman, if a man is going to divorce a woman, it could only be under certain circumstances. It cannot just be a random, I'm tired of you, I'm gonna kick you out. And the man had to write a certificate, which then, in a sense, redeemed the woman to the rest of the culture instead of leaving her a complete outcast. So I think it's important to remember that the law that they quote to him, they're sort of misusing it, right? What does the law tell you? Well, what the law initially tells you is marriage is a covenant between two people forever. That's what the law initially says. And so Moses allowed a man to write her a certificate of divorce, of dismissal, and divorce her No, Moses required a man who was gonna leave her to do that, right? But didn't say, well, it's okay. So they're misquoting the law to a certain extent, in my view. And that's how Jesus comes back and says, well, it's because of hardness of heart. It's because they were already leaving women, but unfortunately, when they did that, these women were left without any male protector and were frowned upon by the rest of society. So historically, men were acting with hard hearts toward women, and the law came in and said, you gotta soften up a bit, guys. If you're gonna do this, here are the ways that it has to happen, right? So there's that historical context as well. Interestingly, the quote that Jesus takes from Genesis, God made them male and female, and for this reason, right? That doesn't actually get associated with marriage until Jesus says this here. That's actually just a description from a creation myth about how it is that human beings came into existence and how, when Adam saw Eve and fell in love with her, oh look, that's why men and women get married. And if you look at it in terms of an ancient creation myth, you understand there is ways to find truth from myth without understanding the story as historically true. And so you can tell what people were after there was an understanding of why it is that often men and women connect up and settle down for life, right? So it's interesting that Jesus chooses to quote that, but I do think in the context of Pharisees coming and testing him, he's kind of put on his back heel a little bit and is drawing from scripture to put them in their place. So there's that going on. I'm not saying that makes it easy. And I think Christians all over struggle with this. And as evidenced by the fact that, we get into all sorts of fights in the church about what is sin in the world around us, right? But you don't hear a lot of pastors having conversations about divorce as a sin because there's too many divorced people in their pews, right? So we distract ourselves, I think, by getting into fights about other things that could be sins, about marriage equality and abortion rights and all these other things that are not contemplated in Scripture. And we frankly don't do a lot of talking about the fact that to say that marriage is a sacrament is to say that God intends for two people who enter into marriage to stay together for life.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean there are no exceptions? Absolutely not. There are. But, it is a tough provision, and it's especially tough because it names a sin. When a marriage comes to an end, no matter what the reason, sin is involved. And it may be sin of one spouse abusing the other, so then the other one has no choice but to go for their own safety. It could be sin of one spouse having an affair. It could be sin of both spouses not nurturing that relationship until they fall out of love. But all of those things are sin. That's sin in the world when you've entered into a relationship that you're going to call marriage and say it's a sacrament and a covenant to God. And that's a really hard thing to say. Does it mean that you're therefore condemned to the fires of hell and should be excommunicated from your church? Well, then you have to ask, well, who did Jesus spend all his time with? People who'd sinned. And what did he do? He healed them and redeemed them and restored them. Okay, I'm going to cede the pulpit to you.
A technical question, because that's the kind I ask.
Mm-hmm.
What he says to his disciples seems to say that it is not so much divorce, but remarriage that causes the sin. And I think that's pretty much the idea of the church, the Catholic Church, that you're living in adultery if you remarry. Is that
The Catholic Church hasn't, their sort of workaround has been to to more talk about annulments, like, well, let's say that the marriage never was real to begin with. So that's one way that some churches have gone to sort of tackle this problem of remarriage after divorce. In the Episcopal Church, we don't really do that. We just acknowledge that we try hard, but sometimes we fall short. We acknowledge that sometimes divorce is the best option given the circumstances that families are in. And when it comes to sinfulness, we acknowledge that there's hurt. No matter how the divorce happens, there's always hurt, and it can be hurt in like the lives of the children, in the lives of the couple, in the lives of the community. Like when you have, I remember I was doing the way the first time a couple in our friend group was going through a divorce, and it just, man, it hurt. Like we didn't know how to. I mean, we loved them both individually, but didn't know how to manage this and be there for them. And that the hurt is, I think, a really powerful sign of it's just brokenness. And sin, we can look at sin as brokenness in a lot of the ways. And I think that one of the reasons why this passage is so difficult is because it's a matter of law. Like we look at it from a legal perspective. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And our minds immediately go to, well, what about exceptions? Like what's an exception? What's an exception to that law? Well, what about this? Well, what if so-and-so's doing this? And is it really that person's fault? And we want to find exceptions to the rule when Jesus is saying, like, no, this is hard. It's a sign of our broken and sinful world. That's really where I think the message is, and Jesus is there to sit with the sinners and the broken and the outcast. Regarding the adultery thing, I think it's just Jesus continuing to just himself just ache over the plight that we put ourselves in.
On the subject of adultery, I can't hear that story without hearing John 8, where they bring to Jesus a woman who's caught in the act of adultery. And again, they're testing him, right? Because it's, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, making her to stand before all of them. And they say, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery." And it's very similar. Now the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say? And he says, "Let the one among you without sin cast the first stone." And one by one, they slink away. And he says to her, "Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No one, sir." And he says, "Neither do I condemn you." So to say it's adultery, we hear it as like Jesus saying, "Adultery!" when really he's just identifying it as problematic and then moving into how do I heal that, I think.
I agree. I think it's also, I hear in addition to all this, and then we can, I don't have a good answer for you, Vicki, but it also, I like to, and I think this is important for a group like this, it holds the church itself as the community to account for the relationships within its body. That we are, we get so hung up on the legal, am I doing the right, like, am I the sinning one or anything? There's a lot in this that that encourages Christians to be there and to support one another when a relationship's going sour. The church should be there. We're there at the beginning when people are lining up to get married, and we put them through the ringer as far as marriage prep. All this is so fresh in my mind. I'm doing my first wedding on Friday, and I'm super excited for a couple, one of whom is divorced, and we talk about that. But we can't, as the church does what it can to prepare couples for marriage, because marriage is hard, but it's also holy and good and a sacrament and a sign of God's love for the world. And I hear in this an imperative that we shouldn't stop supporting people and preparing them and working with them just until they get married. It can't be okay, well, you've done the thing, and so now, like, you're on your own. Good luck. Please remember all the things that we said. And I think it's still incumbent upon all of us it's because a divorce hurts the community in so many ways. And I think that there's a good call to the church to be there for one another when we see our brothers and sisters and siblings going through these awful crises.
In fact,
And to be there for children of divorce.
and in fact, to the extent that someone comes to the church for the blessing of their marriage, everyone in attendance is asked, just as we are asked when we witness a baptism, will all of you witnessing these promises do all in your power to uphold these persons in their marriage? So the church does have a role if you're married in the church. So you're right.
The problem I see is that when married people are having problems, they keep it to themselves, and they don't want to broadcast it. So nobody knows. They come to church all smiles and everything, and, unless they are their very closest friends, they probably don't have an inkling, so they don't know how to go about trying to support these people.
Which is why in marriage prep, we say to couples, by the way, the only way we can uphold that promise is if you tell us. Just like we say to parents, by the way, the only way we can uphold this promise is if you tell us when your kids are having troubles, right? The other thing is that's why we are required to have some level of premarital counseling, either done by us or done by a third-party counselor. And I always refer my couples to a third-party counselor, because then when their marriage gets hard, they've already been through the process of picking up the phone and calling a counselor and saying, we need to come in and talk. And they have somebody they can call.
Did you have something, Paige?
Yeah, this chapter is, for multiple reasons, like as we've said, is tough, but I remember growing up, I had multiple friends who parents went through just really nasty divorces, or stuck together just because they had kids and they could not, even though those marriages should have ended, by all rights, but they stuck together for that, or in my own personal life, one of my relatives, that divorce, for the safety of everyone involved, had to occur. And it was just absolutely tragic for multiple reasons I won't go into. But it's thinking of this passage. It's this last section that really bugs me, because I'm like, I can already get over nuances between the clobber verse part, but being gay, I can get through that. But that last section is just, this is where I cannot seem to really, I can't find the nuance in this at all. And I know we've talked about it, but I still don't fully get this after you talking about it, because that's basically saying, well, you've, I don't really care. You're committing adultery. It's like, well, no, this person literally beat the daylights out of me, or we hate each other, or it's like, you really want us to get in worse and worse fights and have our kids scarred because of this, and we have to stick together, or like, I'm getting beaten when we stay up. It's like, so, or this person is ill and has a problem. I can't keep, the kids can't be safe around them. Like, I don't understand this verse. I can't get over it. It's something that there's a missing nuance there that I can't understand. And so
Marriage in the ancient world is very different than marriage today. And I suspect that if we had Jesus incarnate standing in the middle of the room, aware of our current context, this comes out very differently. And I think sometimes we get to a point where we just say, we don't live in this culture. And what we can take away from this is not going to be a straight on interpretation. Would Jesus agree that a person who is being physically abused, emotionally abused by their spouse has every right to move out of that and move toward health and wholeness? Yes, I believe Jesus would.
I agree.
Does that mean that therefore the divorce is good or what God intended? No. What God intended was that one spouse wouldn't be beating the life out of the other, and that they would stay married together for their whole life. And I think that's the spirit in which we ought to be reading this.
Yeah.
Well, and the vows are to love and to cherish. And when those vows aren't honored, who should stay in an abusive relationship? And of course, back then, we didn't have any shelters for women.
Well,
You
we
know?
also didn't have love and cherish language.
Well, that's true.
Understand that it was a contract, between two families. It was just it's a different world.
Yeah.
So to bring all of our cultural assumptions about what marriage should be to this discussion that's happening over 2,000 years ago is really, really hard. Right?
And the Bible also says, be good to your slaves.
Right.
Yeah.
It's in that category too.
Yes. And I think if I think that if you're struggling with this verse, then that means you're taking it seriously, and you've got to. If you're not struggling with this verse, then I don't know what's going on. That's tough. Yes.
I think part of the reason too that people struggle with it is depending on the Christian tradition that they were raised in, there has not always historically been the best discussion or support for these things. I mean, I can certainly say, like, my parents were very Catholic, still are very Catholic. They are people that have an annulment. And not only that, but there are other annulments that exist in my family where these were marriages that were for 40 plus years. And then they, literally these people, like, at the brink of retirement are dissolving it. But like in talking to the individuals involved, I think a lot of it was just like a complete miseducation and set of support from the engagement forward. There was no support system to have even a conversation like this, to talk about it, or to say, like, how are we thinking about this? Like, it was literally like, yeah, we're gonna get married so that we can hook up, so that we can then fulfill the covenant that we were put here to do. I'm gonna say as straight people, that was what they were thinking. I mean, that was the mindset. But I think, like, as I read this, I think I kind of think about it symbolically, like, in the sense of, I mean, if it's supposed to be, like, if we think about it through, like, the lens of, like, fruitfulness, which I know a lot of people equate to having children, but, like, I don't personally necessarily think that that's the only way that we can talk about being fruitful.
I hope not.
But if we talk about, like, things that are life-giving and life-supporting, when you're getting married, you are essentially saying, I'm going to take on another life automatically out the gate. And so if we kind of think about the concept of, like, what Jesus is, it's like, he's life-sustaining for us. And then it's like this concept of everlasting life. And then we kind of apply the application back at our own, I guess, responsibility here on earth, whether it be to our spouse or potential children that you bring, or others that you, like, take into the fold, whether it be, like, in a personal covenant or that of a community. Like, I think that that's actually where the failure is it's like if you're signing up for a marriage, but then you're gonna be like a cyclical cheater, let's just say, you are, like, destroying that person's life. You're kind of, in essence, destroying your own life. I think that that's more the reflection I have, is, like, recognizing this life-giving or life-taking power that you're entering into through this really important thing that, like, has a lot more power than other actions that we might otherwise take that are life-giving or life-taking. I don't know. That might be a little overly philosophical for this circle.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Let me just say one thing. When I finally got to the point where I knew that I had to divorce my husband, I went to a priest in my church at the time, and I said, but I promised till death do us part. And after I had explained what our marriage was, was like. She said, your marriage has been dead for a long time. She said, you're not necessarily promising until one or the other of you dies, but your marriage is dead. And she encouraged me to get a divorce. And in case y'all are wondering, my husband was an alcoholic. And no, he didn't beat me. But it was an emotional abusive kind of thing, you know. But, and I never did remarry, and neither did he. So that doesn't mean he didn't commit adultery, because he did before we divorced. But I don't think that if I had found someone that I could really love and that really loved me, and we did remarry, I don't believe I would have been committing adultery.
I'm curious how the Episcopal Church has gotten from this to us being able to have a clergy member who is married and, you know, gay. So, I mean, it's important to me. This might be a big question, but it's important to me to be in a church that doesn't just tolerate me as a sinner, as a gay person, but who accepts who I am. So how did the Episcopal Church get to where we are now?
We are welcome in the midst of a study of chapter 10. To save that question for next week.
Okay.
I mean, I don't want to say we won't answer it.
I'm happy to stick around
Okay.
afterwards, and we can talk.
In short, be assured that the Episcopal Church does not tolerate people even though we think they're sinful, right? Like that's not the philosophy.
We embrace.
I'm looking at 10 minutes till 8.
Yes.
And I'm wanting us
And I'm also
to
not.
have some conversation about the rest of the chapter.
We can have some, but the hard part was here.
That's
Like,
the hard part, right? Like, and it's
Yes.
worthy of our time.
and being able to, I mean, anyone can spend time on like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Like, we don't need to like fuss over that. And there's some other stuff in this, but this was the hard part. This is the one, like, this is how you read Scripture. You read it in community. You wrestle with it. You don't have to have it all figured out before you close the book. You can close the book and like come back to it and talk to your siblings in Christ about it. And that. So you were doing the thing. You were doing the thing.
I would agree that like that's one of the things that when I come face to face with God, I'd really like to have a conversation with God about. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that there? What were you
There are
talking
so many
about?
things like that.
Yes. We won't read through this piece by piece. What parts did y'all, in the rest of this chapter, is there anything that, because we don't have much time, is there anything that like really like, I don't know, jumped out, or, because I mean, I'd rather hear something from y'all and then we'll dive in there as opposed to me just going forward. Anything in the rest of this chapter that really you want to talk about?
One thing I have marked in the verse 20, when he's talking to the young man,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus looking at him loved him.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
It's a fantastic.
It's such a great
Yeah.
verse. Jesus
I
looking at
didn't
him
hear what
loved him
Vicky
and
said.
said, "You lack one thing.
Yeah, that's
Go sell what you own and give the money to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven." Right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
there is a sense in which that is every bit as hard as what Jesus has to say about divorce. Because how many of us sitting here have a 401k? I mean, right? That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
It's every bit as hard as the discussion about divorce,
Mm-hmm.
if not harder.
I think it's fascinating. I think so much of this chapter is talking about like power and relationships of power and domination and in how it plays out in different ways within marriages and within like wealth disparities of wealth situations and like and even just like literally like that it comes up again the if you want to be like the first shall be last, the last shall be first, you have to be a servant of all in order to be whatever, paraphrasing, but like so it's just being reiterated over and over and over again that like when we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about someone who sits firmly on the side of those who lack power in society and says, I am here to love you, to be alongside you, and to help you in your plight, which I think is, even with the Bartimaeus story, I mean, he's literally healing him, like, is interesting.
Can I comment on that? Like, this and Bartimaeus, those two stories, they bookend. Like this one little section that scholars have sort of, they chop things up and do whatever they want. But a lot of scholars really look at this rich young man and Bartimaeus as like, we've talked about the Markan sandwich. Like, this is like a big version of that. There's this man who says he's followed all these commandments, at least all the ones that would actively influence negatively another human being's life, like no murdering, stealing, defrauding, and he's asked to sell all he owns and follow. The follow part is also very important, and he can't do it. And then when Jesus is outside of Jericho, he encounters Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus, who has nothing. The only thing that he has to his name is a cloak. And when he sees Jesus, without even being asked, he throws off his cloak. He has literally gotten rid of everything. And Jesus heals him, and Bartimaeus' response is to follow. Bartimaeus gets in line with all the people behind Jesus, and they continue their road from Jericho to Jerusalem. Jesus' invitation for him is to do what Bartimaeus did. He said, I want you to be Bartimaeus. I will heal you. I want you to get rid of everything that you own and follow me, because we're going to Jerusalem and nothing else matters. At this point, nothing else matters. Sell all you own, get in line, we're going to Jerusalem. And the rich young man walks away, but Bartimaeus follows.
I love the imagery of that story, because he's sitting there and shouting out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many sternly ordered him to be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
I find that juxtaposition amazing. And he proud even louder. So I can just picture that. It's just like, oh, that's amazing.
I love that Jesus does not assume he knows what Bartimaeus wants.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that you want me to do for you? And how often do we look at someone and we think we know exactly what they need?
Mm-hmm.
Because they scream need to us. But Bartimaeus could have easily said, all I have is this one cloak, and it's falling apart and threadbare. Could I have yours?
It reminds me of
But his side was more important.
It reminds me of last week whenever we were talking about, I think it was last week, we were talking about like children in church, in the Orthodox Church, and lots of stuff. John loves to tell this story about how in one of the Orthodox churches, I can't remember which one, during the Divine Liturgy, when it gets to like an important part in the Divine Liturgy, the children are allowed to just like freely run around the church and just like be children in the church. But the person that's nearest to them, when it becomes this really important part of the liturgy, will just like grab onto the child and like essentially like parent in a certain sense that the child that's nearest to them, because they're all the children of the community, are the children of the community. They're not just the children of the parents that are members of the community. And it, for some reason, this chapter talks about the children and the childlikeness being an important part of entering into heaven. And then it reminds me of Bartimaeus. It's like, how often do we like sit there and like cast judgment on children that are being loud in the church service or whatever? And but Bartimaeus sees Jesus and yells and shouts and and tries to get his attention. And it's like, it feels very childlike to me, but in like a biblical way. It's like Bartimaeus is unashamed of the fact that he loves Jesus, he wants to follow Jesus, and he wants healing from Jesus. And
He has become like a child.
yes.
We're wrapping up, but let me commend to you a rereading starting in chapter 8 and going through chapter 10, because just like the rich man and Bartimaeus form one of those sandwiches, chapter 8 begins with a man who cannot see, a blind man that Jesus heals. And then this section ends with a blind man that Jesus heals. And in the middle of that, 3 times, Jesus is trying desperately to help his disciples understand, we're going to Jerusalem, this is what matters, and they are blind to what he's trying to tell them. And it's really it's masterfully told. So.
Yeah. People just say, Mark, oh, well, it's the shortest, it's the most condensed, it's just like the facts you need to know, but like it's also literary genius. Like it's wonderful.
Great storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Is that, do we take?
It's gonna be snacks.
Yeah, we got snacks.
I'm gonna stop the recording. There are snacks. Help yourselves.
Lots of snacks.
And once again, we welcome you back, Father Ted, to talk with us about Episcopal Church polity. How do we organize ourselves?
Church polity, how much fun. Yes, how do we, as a church, kind of generally, like Christianity, how do we organize ourselves? What are some of the things that the church has found over centuries to help us be the church, to help us fulfill the mission that Christ has given us in the world? And how specifically do we as Anglicans and Episcopalians fit into that? What does that look like? Where did it come from? So let's start kind of broad. And before we even talk about what it means for Episcopalians, I just want to spend a minute with what it means for us as Christians. So I have a feeling I moved my ribbon in order to mark my psalm. 854. If you've got a prayer book in front of you. We're going to start at 855. But read the part on 854 too, because it's excellent. If at the end of this you feel like we've missed any of the questions and answers in the catechism at the end of the way, like just go back and reread it. Like the catechism in the prayer book is pretty good. Questions, answers, it's excellent. Like the catechism has answers to everything. So right now we're going to look at the part. Well, we'll start right at the top of the page. I'm going to read the question, and I'd like for y'all to read the answer back. What is the mission of the church?
The mission of the church is to restore all people to unity with God and each other in Christ.
How does the church pursue its mission?
The church pursues its mission as it prays and worships, proclaims the gospel, and promotes justice, peace, and love.
Through whom does the church carry out its mission?
The church carries out its mission through the ministry of all its members.
Okay, so now everything kind of leads to the next section. And who are the ministers of the church?
The ministers of the church are lay persons, bishops, priests, and deacons.
Okay, before we go any farther, for a large part of the history of the church, the church has messed up that answer, I think. For hundreds of years, the understanding was the ministers of the church are just the bishops, the priests, and the deacons. And you'll see that here in the Book of Common Prayer, what is the first group of people mentioned? Laypersons. That is exactly right. The laity make up the overwhelming majority of the church. It's a small percentage of us who have been forced to go to seminary and wear all black and put on really uncomfortable collars every day and not take Sundays off. The ministers of the church are primarily the lay persons. this was something that was foundational to this version of the Book of Common Prayer, the 1979 revision. This idea of the ministry of all the baptized. That our prayer book is very specific about making sure that everyone is doing the work of the mission of the church. So, that being said, what is the ministry of the laity?
The ministry of lay persons is to represent Christ in his church, to bear witness to him wherever they may be, and according to the gifts given them, to carry on Christ's work of reconciliation in the world, and to take their place in the life, worship, and governance of the church.
So, based on that answer, what you're signing up as baptized lay members of the church is 24/7, 365 sort of way of being a human being, that you're to represent Christ and his church throughout the world, wherever you may be, whenever that may happen to be, carrying on the work of reconciliation. But tonight, we're really going to talk about sort of that last little part, life, worship, and governance of the church. We're going to talk a lot about church structures, specifically how we are organized as an Episcopal church. I'm going to use probably a lot of weird, like, Episcopal words and some strange jargon. If I use a word that you haven't heard before, please stop me. This is also like, I heard this weird thing the Episcopalians do. So if you've got those kinds of questions, this is a great time to ask those, because we're diving into just weird Episcopal stuff all over, front and back. But we're going to talk a lot about governance and how we're structured and organized. So next question: what is the ministry of a bishop?
The ministry of a bishop is to represent Christ in his church, particularly as apostle, chief priest, and pastor of the diocese, to guard the faith, unity, and discipline of the whole church, to proclaim the word of God, to act in Christ's name for the reconciliation of the world, and the building up of the church, and to ordain others to continue Christ's ministry.
Every time I read that one, I just get like overwhelmed by what it means to be a bishop, and it's just incredible that like what a terrifying sort of responsibility to guard the faith, unity, and discipline of the whole church. I just think that that's remarkable. Whenever I run up against a bishop who's annoying me or saying stuff that I think is dumb, I try to remember this and like the ministry that's been laid on their shoulders and what that means, and just kind of be in awe. Like you don't have to agree with everything. You don't have to agree with anybody in the Episcopal Church. Let's just get that clear. You don't have to agree with anyone, and you don't always have to agree with all of the bishops. The bishops don't agree with each other, so all the time. Their ministry is really unique and special. We're going to talk about it being historic a little bit. We've got a fun handout for you guys. But that is the ministry of a bishop.
Are you going to explain to people that we have two bishops?
We will talk about our strange bishop situation, and mine is even stranger. So like my personal bishop situation. Oh yeah. So next page. What is the ministry of a priest or presbyter?
The ministry of a priest is to represent Christ and his church, particularly as pastor to the people, to share with the bishop in the overseeing of the church, to proclaim the gospel, to administer the sacraments, and to bless and declare pardon in the name of God.
So whenever you see Mother Rebecca and I running around acting foolish, doing crazy things, you can call us to account. Like, this is the ministry of a priest or presbyter. So this is what we've what has been laid on us as priests of the church. And we're not perfect, but every day we try to live up to this and the way that it's sort of articulated in our ordination vows. So you can hold our feet to the fire if you need to. Also, just that we use the word priest in the Episcopal Church. Some places use the word presbyter, which means the same thing. It's a little bit closer to the Greek word you find in the New Testament, presbyteros. Also, going back to bishop, that comes from a word. I had a Greek professor who could tell me how you got from episkopos to bishop, like how it moved through the languages, and this vowel was silenced and whatever weirdness. But Episcopal, which is our church, means having bishops. In the New Testament, they didn't come up with a fancy word to describe this role. It was just overseer. And you can piece it apart in the Greek. Epi, like on top of, and over, like your epiduris is your skin. It's on top of everything. And scopos, like a scope, like on a rifle or something like that. So something you can see, an overseer, microscope. Sure. We're in Texas. Yes, that also works too. Thank you. So that's where that word comes from. We are the Episcopal Church, meaning just basically we're a church that has bishops, and we'll talk about how we arrived at that name. Next question: what is the ministry of a deacon?
The ministry of a deacon is to represent Christ in his church, particularly as a servant of those in need, and to assist bishops and priests in the proclamation of the gospel and the administration of the sacraments.
So we, until very recently, we had a deacon here work at Transfiguration. We've had part-time deacons for a long time. We don't have one right now. Deacons have a very special role. There's and the way they move around is a little bit different. They also had very similar ordination vows. A lot of it's the same that we did. Mother Rebecca and I we're still deacons in a way. That never goes away. We were both ordained deacons before being ordained priests. But in that sort of method of ordination, if we're not careful, we can lead it to think that deacons are like junior priests or something like that. And that's not the intention at all. Deacons are a profoundly important order. We hear about them in they come straight from Scripture, from Stephen and the other 7. Stephen, was he one of 7, or was it Stephen plus 7? I don't remember. It doesn't matter. Who were selected because there was a lot of work that needed to be done in addition to the sacramental duties of priests, and they needed help, and they found people who were called to help the widows and orphans and make sure that people were being taken care of, that people were fed, that people had clothes, people had places to stay, and to bring the needs of the church, needs of the world, to the church's attention so that the church could go out and meet those needs as best as possible. What is the duty of all Christians?
The duty of all Christians is to follow Christ, to come together week by week for corporate worship, to work, pray, and give for the spread of the kingdom of God.
So that first part, the duty of all Christians is to follow Christ. It's a reiteration of you'll notice in every single one of those, layperson, bishop, presbyter, deacon, they all start out the exact same way. The ministry is to represent Christ in his church. And so this is just another reiteration to follow Christ. The duty of all Christians, it's communal, to come together week by week. There are plenty of Christians in this country that think that they can be one by themselves. And that doesn't make sense. That doesn't really exist in our Anglican polity, our way of being Christian. and I'm incredibly thankful for that. If I just sat by myself and tried to be a Christian in isolation, I would come up with all kinds of crazy ideas. Like, my echo chamber is noisy and ridiculous. So I'm grateful that we come together week by week, and so that we can be Christians in community, so we can practice being Christians on each other by acts of forgiveness and reconciliation and study and prayer. So we practice on each other so we can go and do these things to the world around us. Okay, so that's the prayer book part. Those are, that's just kind of a basic overview. I didn't bring with me, I've got this fun book or document called Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry. It was a statement by the World Council of Churches in 1982, I think. And it was like 100 theologians from all across Christianity, Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Methodists, just runs the gamut. And what's so cool about it is it goes through and it describes like orders of ministry. It describes what we believe about the Eucharist and what we believe about baptism. And it's remarkable because we agree on so much. These are like so integral to what it means to be the church. These are the these common understandings. There are a few. It has a few like, well, you know, some parts of the church don't like that people baptize infants. So there are disagreements, and it kind of fleshes those out too. But it's this really cool. Maybe I will email. You can get it online, and it's just really neat to read through, and it gives me hope for the future of the church, that people could come together and write this amazing document about what it means to be a Christian, and so many can agree. And even when we disagree, they can still like all sign up onto it and just be like, we're working on that. We have trouble with this, but it's kind of remarkable. I will send that to you, and maybe you can send it out just because it's cool. It's also kind of nerdy and weird, and like if you look at it and you're like, this is dumb, then don't worry about it. So the church, it's made up of lay people, bishops, priests, and deacons, none of whom are like weird like ghosts or spiritual people or invisible forces. The church is really made of like actual human beings, boots on the ground people that interact and live together. The church is not some ideal that we're trying to live into. The church is humans. The church is this group of people right here. This is the church. The church happens up there. The church happens at Austin Street Center. The church happens at Youth First Texas. The church happens driving around Dallas with a weird like army field organ on a trailer while people are singing Christmas carols. And y'all are going to hear about that later because that's a thing that's going to happen in January. So
We want you all to sign up to come and carol with us.
yes, it's going to...
In January?
January 2.
January 2nd. It's a Sunday afternoon from...
Christmas doesn't begin till December 25th, and it lasts for 12 days.
Yes.
Is it
So-
organ in
Yes, we have a weird old like army field organ.
is this Joe's?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
We've
So
seen it.
you've seen it. Yeah. It's
Oh,
Just
yeah?
casually throw that out there.
anyway.
Shannon.
That is the church. The church does things like this. It's not an invisible like theoretical thing. It's real people who are trying to make real impact on the world by sharing the love of Jesus with them. So that's what you're signing up for, just as a warning. Here at Transfiguration, we belong to, so that was sort of big, and now we're going to come back down to small, and we're going to talk about how we organize ourselves, and we're going to do that from like the smallest little bit and going forward. So the Episcopal Church of the Transfiguration, we use the word church. What we are is we're a parish. A parish is a unique body of Christians that's kind of Well, the definition is changing. I would say it's like a local thing, like the people in your neighborhood. But now we've got people all over. That COVID's changed some of that, and we've got people that I consider parishioners who are from all over. Like we've got someone coming. She lives in England, and she's going to be here at Christmas, and she's been doing all of our stuff online. And
Joined the church.
she joined.
Away last year in the
Yeah, she's fantastic. So we use the word parish. The English use the word parish. It's something we inherited. Also, if you're from Louisiana, that's what you call a county. But this is the parish, and the parish is kind of like the smallest little unit, but it's not an independent thing. There's no such thing as like an independent Anglican parish, really. It doesn't exist. There are other Christian traditions where you can have independent congregations. In lots of traditions, that's the thing. Like Baptists will just have like a group, and that's just your thing, and you're only accountable to your little group. Kind of, I'm oversimplifying, but
Congregationalist structures is what they call it, right?
sure, yeah. Yes, being congregationalist is definitely part of it. But we're not like that. We are a parish, and as a parish, we belong to a diocese. We'll get to diocese in a second. So parishes they really function as a group of Christians, and there is one senior clergy person who leads this group. All parishes have what's called a rector, or ideally. There's some parishes can be in transition. Maybe you don't have a rector right now. Maybe you have someone that just came in and they're not exactly the rector yet, but they're the priest in charge. Episcopal parish has to have a priest fill this role, or a bishop actually can do it, but technically a deacon can't. Again, not that deacons are incapable of doing this, but deacons have other work that's really important, and running parishes is not in the list of their assigned duties that God needs them to do. So we have a rector. Casey Shobe is our rector. And the traditional way of looking at this is the rector, in order to get all of the ministry done and everything that he needs, or she, they have a staff, and the staff helps. And we assist the rector in the life of the parish. And but what's, I think, more important, and what the Transfiguration does so well, is instead of just the staff helping out, it's really the whole community. The whole parish we've got, parish leaders within the congregation outnumber the staff like 5 to 1. The ministry of the church is, as the prayer book said, to bring Christ's healing love into the world. We practice that together. We worship together. We pray together. And we also go out and serve. And all of those things are important. It's not that we do one so that the other can happen. They all inform what we do together. The service that we do outside the walls informs the worship that we do on Sunday morning, and vice versa. And it informs how we interact and live together and take care of one another. It informs how we raise our children together, and how we take responsibility when a couple in our parish is having a hard time and they're thinking about ending it. So that is kind of that's the local parish. So you mentioned congregationalists. We're not congregationalists. We have a vestry, which sort of congregationalists. A congregationalist church would be one where where it's a little more, the congregation votes on what happens. We don't actually.
Governs itself.
The congregation governs itself. That is a much better way of saying that. We're not that. The rector has a lot of authority to do to kind of steer ministry, which is we think is a good thing, and has worked in Anglicanism for a long time, because we prayerfully choose who's going to be that person, and we work together. But it's the rector's job to kind of steer ministry. We also have a thing called a vestry, and it's an elected group of Christians who are going to help the parish in terms of financial things. They're fiduciaries for the parish. They're in charge of making sure the buildings and. Are you kidding? Okay.
So rector, spiritual,
Rector-
vestry, temporal.
Yeah, that works. So we're in a parish, and if we go to the next level, remember I said that you don't really have an independent parish. It doesn't really work. All parishes belong to a diocese. A diocese is headed by a bishop. We are part of the Diocese of Dallas. Our bishop is George Sumner. We have special arrangement with another bishop because George Sumner disagrees with our some of our theology about marriage and sexuality and a few other things, and we can get into all that later, but that's not important to this
That division
overall.
is a lot like the division between the rector and the vestry, where Bishop Sumner here in Dallas governs our life temporal,
Okay.
so ownership of the land, payment of assessment that helps run the diocese, going to convention and meetings like that, and Bishop Smith oversees our spiritual life.
Yes. Normally, the bishop would kind of do all of that. The diocese is run by the bishop, but there's also a convention. The convention sets rules, and it's made up of elected clergy and laity from all the congregations.
And it
meets annually. Parish also has an annual meeting, which in some parishes, that's what they use to elect the vestry. We don't do that here because it's not required that we do it that way. But the diocese has an annual convention. We elect people. We elect 5 lay people from the parish to represent us at Dawson Convention, and all the clergy go and they have a vote. I don't, because I don't belong to this diocese. I belong to a different diocese, and I am just licensed to be here. Again, like my whole situation is weird. So there's a diocese, and a diocese is run by a bishop. And that's kind of like the most fundamental basic unit within Anglicanism. A diocese with a bishop, parishes underneath. We're also part of the Episcopal Church. And the Episcopal Church is it's an international church of dioceses here in the United States, dioceses in Europe, dioceses in Asia. The largest diocese in the Episcopal Church is the Diocese of Haiti. So we're part of this large multinational church, which was formed after the American Revolution, because after we broke ties with Britain, we couldn't really be part of the Church of England anymore. So it was not cool to be Church of England anymore. So shortly after the Revolutionary War, the Anglicans in the United States, those who worshipped and lived a life according to the style of the Church of England, reformed the Episcopal Church. All this was happening at the same time the United States was being founded. Everybody was reading the same books, the same philosophers. And so we decided that we would be governed by a bicameral legislature, which should sound familiar. The Episcopal Church is, unlike a parish that has a rector and a diocese that has a bishop, we don't really have a overarchbishop or like prince of the church. We have a general convention, which has 2 houses, the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies, which is priests and deacons and lay people. House of Bishops, bishops. And there is a sort of a first among equals. And that is the presiding bishop, which was originally just the person who had been the bishop the longest. That was the presiding bishop, and then they changed it. Our presiding bishop is Michael Curry. He was the Bishop of North Carolina and was elected to be the presiding bishop of the United States. That person serves in that role for 9 years. Our General Convention of the Episcopal Church meets every 3 years. And that's where stuff like prayer book revision gets talked about. They talk about the overall mission of the church in the United States. there's a lot of money that good work is done with, and the budgets are set at General Convention. General Convention also has the House of Deputies, which is made up of 4 priests and 4 laity from each of the dioceses. It's a massive number of people. We've got, 110 dioceses in the Episcopal Church. This is anecdotal, but it's the second largest legislative body in the world after like the Indian Parliament, which means it doesn't get work done very fast. But it gets holy work done. It happens every 3 years, and it moves around the United States.
And it will happen again.
And it will happen next year.
in-
It got pushed. It'll be in Baltimore this coming summer. And like someone in this room might be going as a delegate to General Convention in Baltimore. Her name's Mother Rebecca, so that's kind of cool, which is really great, y'all. It's fantastic. So that's the Episcopal Church. And then we also exist as part of, we're part of this global Anglican communion. The Anglican communion is sort of a group of national and regional churches. It doesn't, there's nothing about the Anglican communion implies authority over any of the national churches. They all function independently, but because we're Christians and we believe in this unity, we all believe in a church that is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Catholic meaning universal, apostolic meaning like descendant from the apostles, and we go and we're sent out. So believing in this unity means that at least as Anglicans, we can get along and we can form these relationships with other Anglican churches. And the Anglican Communion exists because of the awful thing of British colonialism, which continues to, colonialism in general, which is, we're still feeling the repercussions of, it's still happening. But when, as countries broke away, former colonies kind of broke away and became their own countries, the people that were Anglicans still wanted to worship in the Anglican style. We were the first to do this. Really, the birth of the Episcopal Church was kind of the foundation of the Anglican Communion. And we were the ones that kind of pushed to start, let's get together. We have, the Anglican Communion is led by Archbishop Justin Welby, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury. That doesn't mean that he has, again, no authority here. He's the Archbishop of the Church of England. But he is a symbol of our unity and first among equals as far as the bishops go within Anglicanism. The Anglican Communion is largely concentrated now in the Southern Hemisphere. The average Anglican, if you put them all together and picked the average, it would be a sub-Saharan African woman. That is the average Anglican in the world. There are 85 million Anglicans throughout the world. I think there are 40 different provinces of the Anglican Communion. The Episcopal Church is one of them. That's kind of the rundown. What else do I have?
Well, you want to talk about one about the handout?
Yes. Okay. So there are lots of things that we do to kind of define our unity and get along. There's this, in 1888, bishops from around the Anglican Communion together came and identified 4 core themes of what it means to be Anglican. It's called the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral, and it's in the historical documents section of your prayer book. But one of the things it references is the historic episcopate. So one thing that's important to Anglicanism, and not just Anglicanism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, other churches, is this idea of apostolic succession. And what it means is, in a very real sense, all of the bishops of the church that do this apostolic succession thing, Catholics, Anglicans, Orthodox, Lutherans, every bishop can trace, like, when someone is ordained, hands are laid on their head. And every bishop can trace whoever laid hands on their head going all the way back to Peter and to Jesus.
Well, not actually all the way to Peter. Sorry, if your chart, our chart here has some coming under John.
Oh, that's exciting too. But ours is Peter, right?
Archbishops of Rome come under Peter, but
Yes.
it appears to me that the bishops of Lyon trace their lineage to John,
Okay.
and it seems to suggest that in Canterbury we come from both Rome and Lyon, both. Yeah,
Okay.
see what I'm saying?
Yes.
The arrows.
Anyway, this is just a fun little chart. And if you look at the red, so talking to y'all who will be, who are discerning if you would like to be confirmed, your confirmation will come from Bishop Wayne Smith, who was the 10th Bishop of Missouri, and he's now the interim Bishop of Southern Ohio, and he is our bishop for all pastoral and liturgical actions that we do because of our strange situation. You will be confirmed by Wayne Smith. Wayne Smith was made a bishop by Clark Grew, or he was the chief consecrating bishop. It takes 3 bishops to make another bishop, which is really just like insurance, I think. It takes 3 bishops to make a bishop. Clark Grew was the chief consecrator of Wayne Smith. And you look back, Edmund Lee Browning, who was the 24th presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, was the chief consecrator for Clark Grew. And so you can go through that and trace back all of the bishops back to William White. Actually, Samuel Seabury was a bishop before William White, but people gave him a hard time, and they weren't nice to him. William White actually had more to do with the organization of the church than Samuel Seabury did. But you can go back, and this is just something cool for you to consider and think about this long line of bishops. And it's something. It's interesting. It's something as Anglicans we've agreed that is important to us, and it actually puts up some barriers, but it opens up some doors. Globally, this is widely recognized and appreciated. Locally, it means it's a point of sticking when you're trying to work with other churches that don't have that for whom the historic episcopate is not a big deal, like the Methodist Church. What you got, Pace?
So looking at it, goes down vaguely history on Leon thing that's kind of ticking something in my mind, but here we ended with the bishops of Rome. We end with the battalion.
Yeah, it's not current on bishops of Rome. It's not current on archbishops of Canterbury. What it's trying to help you understand, this is something, if you look at the top, that's got the Diocese of Dallas seal. It's trying to help you understand where it is that the bishops of Dallas fit into the apostolic succession. So yeah, John Moore, for example, under Archbishop of Canterbury, he's like 1820 something, right? So Welby's not here, current popes are not here, but it's giving you enough history to see where it is that we come into play.
Yes.
Yeah, if we have a bishop, do we call the church where the bishop reside? Do we still call them a cathedral?
Yes, generally speaking, a bishop. It's the church where the bishop's chair is where what it is.
Can we talk about some of the other terms like dean and curate and things like that?
Sure. Oh my gosh, y'all, there's so much. Dean refers to someone who's in charge of 10 or more. Historically, we give that title to the chief priest at a cathedral who sort of runs the parish. The cathedrals typically are either a parish or sort of an abbey type thing. So the priest who's given responsibility over the life of the congregation of the cathedral is a dean. Additionally, dioceses can have subgroups of parishes called a deanery or a convocation, just for, again, organization. Sometimes that person is called dean. curate just means like nobody cares about you and you have all the grunt work to do.
Curate means newly ordained priest who's in their first year, or deacon, a deacon, newly ordained person. And it generally at this point, not always, but generally at this point refers to someone who's just been ordained, who is placed by a bishop in a parish for a time certain, often 2 years, sometimes only 1 year. And the position is funded in part by the bishop's office, by the diocesan budget, and in part by the parish budget. And so that's generally what, I know that's not what you are, but that's generally what a curate is.
And I also think,
Internship?
so, a step up. It's a step up from something. It carries with it the idea that I'm still very much in formation. You never stop being formed as a priest, but like I'm still in a rather intense program of formation for my first few years out of seminary, and that's I have some colleagues that came out of seminary and got like fancier titles, but I wanted the title curate to be clear that like I'm here to like continue my learning, to start off on the right foot in the hopes that it, teaches me good things for the rest of my 29 and a half years of priestly ministry coming up. and I'll stick around and we'll go through.
Just one question, quick question.
Uh-huh.
We keep talking about the unique situation we're in. Can we talk about that next week?
Yes,
Okay.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say.
absolutely.
Because
We
I'm
can
like,
talk
I
about
want
that
more
next week.
information.
And
We can
Bishop-
definitely talk about that next
Did
week.
Bishop Smith volunteer?
No, Bishop Sumner engaged him professionally, and he is paid for the role that he has with us and with the 2 other churches in Dallas who have elected alternative oversight. And that payment comes directly out of the diocesan budget. So we as a church are not charged extra for that. We do fund the diocesan budget just as all the other parishes in Dallas do. And that budget pays some stipend and travel expenses to Bishop Smith for the role that he plays with us.
And this compromise, Father Casey played a very critical role. You should know.
We can talk about that
Yeah.
next week. Next week.
What's a mission?
Just a last thing on this, like, this is a
Yes,
cool
I'll
little
tell
fancy chart, and if you're really into sort of church history, you can spend a lot of time pouring through it. But when we were reading through the catechism and talking about, the role of the bishop is to guard the tradition and the teaching of the church, this is what that is referring to, right? That there is certain wisdom and revelation about God that came through the person of Jesus Christ and was shared with the apostles, who were sent out as sort of the first bishops, really, the first overseers of everything that Jesus had taught. And so each of the bishops in this chart, and every bishop that isn't listed, because this isn't a full, like we only have Dallas here, we don't have all the dioceses in the United States in the Episcopal Church. But every bishop sees their role, because we as Episcopalians see their role, as preserving and handing on to us the faith that we received through Jesus Christ. So don't get too caught up in the names, but this is like apostolic succession, and to say that we are in apostolic succession is to say that we take very seriously the revelation we received from Jesus and the interpretation of that revelation, even though it changes through and by these bishops and others that they were in community with, right?
Yeah.
We're not sort of just inventing things on our own as a congregation, right?
Let's finish up evening prayer, and then I will sit here and y'all can ask me all kinds of questions.
Yeah.
Finishing morning prayer involves evening prayer involves less page turning.
121.
Thank you. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be